I'm going to go ahead and kick us off again. This is the September meeting of the Peachtree Corners Photography Club. I'm Tracy Rice, I'm president of the club, and I believe all of our board members are present on the call as well. We have a really great program scheduled for tonight, and I know that you're really going to enjoy it. First, I want to welcome that we have two new members of the club since our last meeting. I haven't seen them online here yet, but one is Kenneth Stewart and the other is Vipul Singh. So if we see them join, we can give them a shout out. Hello. Remember to mute your microphones if you're not speaking. And I've learned since last month how to mute individuals. So if we have an unforeseen disruption, I will mute you so that we don't disrupt our speaker who's trying to talk. Let's see, what else do I want to tell you? You can also remember to use the chat feature in the Zoom there. So if you have questions or want to raise your hand, you can use the chat feature. And when we get into the main presentation, Travis will tell us how he wants us to interact with him. Before we get started with the critique of the car photos, however, Ludwig and I want to share an exciting new development, and that is that our club is going to be participating in the Atlanta Celebrates Photography Fall Festival. Atlanta Celebrates Photography is also known as ACP, and I have been a member of the board of ACP for the past 5 years. It's a really great organization, and it produces the largest annual community-oriented photo festival in the United States, and has done that for the last 20 years, so they have quite a track record. And this year, because of the pandemic, where most of the events in the past are held in various locations and venues around town, mostly in town, this year, because of the pandemic, most of it's going to be held virtually. So that gives us a unique opportunity to participate with an online gallery, to showcase our members' work, and to be an integral part of this citywide celebration of photography. So our gallery is going to open on Saturday, September 19th, which is 2 Saturdays from this one. And we're going to have an online reception. There'll be a Zoom invitation, and you'll see more on this in the club news that you'll be getting. And it's going to run through the end of the year with a refresh every 2 weeks. So we'll have an online reception every other Saturday, starting with September 19th. Our theme for the exhibition is going to be scenes around Peachtree Corners, which includes photos from Peachtree Corners and surrounding communities like Norcross, Duluth, Berkeley Lake, Johns Creek, Roswell, and Dunwoody. So pretty much any community that's immediately surrounding Peachtree Corners. So not just Peachtree Corners. What we need from you is to submit your photos for review by our selection team. And that's made up of Alfonso Casero, Ken Hickson, Mario Lombardi, and Richard Phillips. And so what we need from you is to submit photos. So Ludwig is going to share his screen right now very quickly and show you how you would go about submitting your photos.
We have built our gallery already. There is a website, and you can see the URL at the top of what I'm sharing. Oh, it doesn't work worth a darn. Zoom overlay stuff. As Tracy already mentioned, the theme for our exhibition is scenes around Peachtree Corners. And as she mentioned, we are part of Atlanta Celebrates Photography this year. You'll hear more about it in the next days because the APC people will go live with their catalog next Monday, and we will follow with our gallery on Saturday. So right now they are just waiting to get started, and we are waiting to get started. Behind our gallery, there are some huge blank online walls. They need your photos. And if you go to that website, and you can get to it from our regular website as well, there is a link there that says entries are now being accepted. When you click on that, it gets you to a page that describes how it all works. And basically you start by registering. There is an online form there where you register. So we get you hooked into this. As soon as I can thereafter, you will receive an email with a URL for an online folder that is yours. It is private. It is secure. It is the OneDrive folder. You prepare your photos, and it's very, very simple. When you click on that URL, the folder opens in your browser, and you can just drag photos over to it to upload them. It is that simple. Of course, we want your best photos, so go through your archives and try and see how that works for you. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. I don't see any hands up. So please come, please join us, please participate.
And two points that I struggled with. They can't be bigger than 2,400 pixels on the long edge on the top, and they have to be JPEGs. I put up a couple TIFFs.
The TIFFs were about 130 megabytes. So you took up pretty much most of what we have to store photos.
I didn't do it on purpose, but it's an easy mistake to make when you're editing them.
But that's all right. Microsoft doesn't mind. It goes into their basement. But yes, we, on the website that is done in a WordPress system, and there we are limited as to the size, because there we are on a server somewhere in Texas where we don't have quite as much space as Microsoft has in their basement.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Ludwig. So I think now we're ready for the critique of our car photos that were submitted as a follow-on to Peter Malloy's great presentation last month. So I'm curious to see what all we got.
All right, so approach slightly different this time. We ran long before, so what I've done this time is put all the photos kind of back to back in a 7.5 minute thing, and just going to kind of go through. I'll provide feedback on them, try to I'm going to hopefully try to be a little more focused on like constructive areas for improvement instead of just here's the things I really like about it, to hopefully with the goal and effort to maybe provide hopefully some value in terms of the way at least I look at and observe photos, and trying to improve my art, my understanding, all that kind of stuff. But again, all these are just going to be kind of personal opinions of things, and frequently I'm wrong. So we'll see how this goes here. So let me see when you can see one of Bob's many photos here that he submitted. Are we good?
Yeah.
All right. So I'm going to press play here on the thing, and it's going to go, and if it switches, then I'm going to switch with it. So here it looks like we have some sort of vehicle and a face only a mother could love. rusty car that we have going on here. Color wise, not sure how close this was to accurate. I look at the flowers here in the foreground. It makes me think we have some tint to it in terms of change from reality, and there's certainly nothing wrong with that. I like to do that a lot myself. So this one, looks to me like HDR applied with the way that you look at the bumper. I think on this one, to me, when I first saw this, I thought, well, the focus is really on the license plate, and maybe that has significance to somebody. It doesn't necessarily to me. And I look at a car like this, and I'm looking at to me, the interesting pieces are like the tail lights and the shape of the tail lights and that kind of thing. And so for me on this, I probably, for like my standout picture of this, that's where I actually would have personally probably put my attention to on this. So here's one where you have models going on. I think, great shot here, but I think my feedback would be try to get rid of some of the power lines in the background that can be taken out in a few seconds in Photoshop very easily, but good use of depth of field. You got the models kind of in rule of thirds here. Both are in focus. You got a kind of cool reflection on the windshield there with the model in the background. I think I would just kind of get rid of some of the distracting elements, like the pole maybe here on the left-hand side. Here we have a DeLorean, kind of a car that even non-car nuts know what it is. Not sure the context of getting this shot, obviously in the garage of a collector who has a jack and everything. I think to try to get more out of this, it probably would certainly benefit from using either external lighting or bracketing the shot, because we have lots of the shadows going on in the hood, and sort of the lighting just is what it is, pouring in from the side and open window, and obviously probably didn't have room for that. But in terms of trying to improve the shot, I think if you were able to bracket it, that would help. This shot obviously kind of has the face going on here, where they've added the eyes to the side of the car here. Feedback on this would be obviously kind of taking a car show probably, as you can see in the background, but it's, to me, looks a little crooked. Would straighten that with Lightroom, Photoshop, whatever tools you're using, get a little more straight. Crop wise, obviously trying to go in tight here because you're getting rid of the car show aspect of this, but overall pretty good there. Motion shot, I'm assuming panning. You can see some of what looks like kind of the panning shot where you're having to time this, really difficult to do. Good shot with it being in focus. Obviously can't really criticize that, because these are very difficult shots to get, and has kind of the right amount of, you can see the labeling in the background, but it's also blurred, and you get that sense of motion here. Another one from Bob. So, this shows that he spent way more than he was supposed to, but pretty cool shot here of getting them both kind of in that rule of thirds space. Again, both of the cars are sharp, and you have that, really nice movement in the background going on. Definitely a technical shot to get, and well executed. Hard to criticize anything like that, other than his logo in the corner. So here we have a black and white shot, obviously. Pretty cool emphasis on the lines that you're getting. Has the focus is a little odd in terms of like perception and the fact you have the mirror coming off. You know, not exactly sure what my eye wants to do with that. Obviously you can tell it's a car mainly by the mirror, but you also have some you know, interesting lines here. This is not some you know, common I'll say low end car or something based upon the lines that you see there. Here we have a car. You get some context of where it is, where it's located, where the shot's from a few things, which is interesting. You know, the license plate obviously saying Cuba, and then you have, I'll say, non-English words on the building in the background that gives you some context of where this was taken, which that's always kind of cool on a shot that's, you know, say not a car show or something like that, and you have this old car. Perspective wise, I think, I don't know, it feels maybe slightly distorted to me. So I don't know if maybe some lens correction would help with that. Here we have a painterly style shot of a superimposed toy Mercedes in front of the Peachtree Corners Bridge. You know, have rule of thirds. You have some whimsy going on here. You have, you know, landmark. Honestly, I'm not really sure exactly what to do or make of, you know, the meaning of having kind of the gull wing Mercedes here. I'm sure there's context to that I don't know. So here's another car show shot. This one, obviously a little bit different. To me, I wish it was a real kid there doing that and not a staged little dummy puppet, whatever, whatever you want to call this. Certainly clever on the person that did this, but to me, takes away a little bit of the fun of it by like it not actually being a person doing that. You know, so emphasis is really on the kid, that picture there versus the vehicle itself, and more the statement it's making there. And that is the presentation.
Well, that was quite a variety of car photos, wasn't it? I enjoyed that. Thank you, Brian.
Yep.
All right, so now for our main speaker, I'd like to introduce Travis Rhoads. Travis is an international award-winning fine art photographer working in a wide range of photographic genres. He studied architecture at the Savannah School of the College of Art and Design, SCAD, where he received a master's degree. And while he was a student at SCAD, he also took several photography courses that jump-started his passion for photography. He's going to give us a presentation on long exposure photography. And if you look at his list of awards, they go on for 2 pages. So he likes to say that his photography graces many homes around the world. So Travis, take it away. Go ahead and share your screen and welcome. Let us know how we should interact.
If it looks like I'm looking over this way, that's a second screen. So yeah, thanks for having me tonight. I'm looking forward to my first Zoom presentation of this particular presentation tonight. I've done this one for most every other photography club in North Georgia and even a little into South Georgia. So I'm looking forward to this tonight. The way I like to present usually involves walking around and gauging the reaction on people's faces and interaction and having questions. So if questions come up, you know, someone speak up, because I can't really see it as much over here, but speak up because the questions come up usually because of something that I'm discussing in the slide or in my talking. And it makes more sense to go ahead and address those questions at that time rather than waiting until later in the presentation when it might not make as much sense. And trust me, if you're thinking about it, somebody else probably is too. because long exposure is something that's quite different. By a show of hands, how many people have done some long exposures, more than a second or two, like 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes? Awesome. So we've got some people that have done this and some that haven't. So I came into long exposure because I was kind of looking for something else to set my photography apart. When I first got back into pictures, I was taking pictures of race cars at the racetrack, and I liked shooting those slow shutter speeds and the long pans because they had some dynamic look to them and they were more interesting. And my still photography was lacking in that. And then I discovered long exposure photography, and that really kind of kicked off where I am today, almost 10 years later. And it's probably what I do the most, and it's probably what I'm the most passionate about. So tonight's presentation is on the art of long exposure photography. There's some technical stuff, there's some post-production stuff. So again, if anyone has any questions at any time, please let me know. For me, long exposures are all about taking what is normally just a still image of any given scene and turning it into something that's more dynamic. The landscape changes so much when you have a static and still landscape below it, and you can put into motion the clouds, or in some cases the stars, or whatever you have, and it just creates a more interesting photograph that to me is more visually striking and more interesting. I like taking a lot of pictures around water, but a lot of what I see in a picture like this one is there's this visual noise. Can everyone see the cursor that I'm moving around?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. All of this in here, all of this water, to me, that texture sometimes causes the eye to get stuck on it, and it loses the eye on what I really want it to see. So a long exposure, stretching that out to 8 seconds, smoothing out all of that texture, brings out the details in the rocks and in the trees and the colors, and all of those other supporting elements become more prevalent, and the water just becomes something that moves through that scene and doesn't distract as much. I call it something like visual noise. To me, it's just it's a visual thing that is visually distracting sometimes. For me, it creates more dramatic and dynamic images in my architectural work. I have a habit of going and photographing skylines for every city I go to, but I like putting my spin on it and doing them as a long exposure. It just makes it so much more interesting. I always like to say that long exposure photography can turn just an ordinary image into something that's much more extraordinary and much more dynamic and much more engaging for the viewer. I have a tendency at shows to stand behind people and listen to them talk about the images that they're looking at, whether it's mine or somebody else's. And I always get feedback that the long exposures, people sit and try to figure out more about them instead of just seeing it and walking on by. So to me, anytime I can keep the viewer's attention on the image is a good thing. It's all about just creating motion in an image, whether it's like this, that's just 4 seconds, or the previous one that's 2 minutes. It's all about creating some sort of motion in the image. And in this particular scene, it was taking something that was distracting and putting it into motion and giving it a feeling of the water coming in underneath that pier. Before, it was just little foam bits that were really distracting because they were spread out all over the place, but when they were pin sharp, they just didn't look very good. And you know, I got in knee deep in this really cold water. I'm going to make it look more interesting. So the water was coming in from both directions on the pier, so the swirls that it made underneath the pier were much more interesting. So a 4-second exposure let that motion come in. Because in an image like this, the sky didn't have a whole lot going on. The color was nice, but there weren't any clouds or anything. So the interest really needed to be in the foreground.
I have a question.
Okay.
You picked the 4-second exposure, and I wonder how many other test exposures, or if you want to call them that, how many sample exposures you took? Did you start at 1 second and go to 30 or?
That's a
Just-
great question. A lot of what I do in a scene like this is looking for, when you're working with waves, because they break at different places along the beach, they take different amount of time to get to you, or they have a different effect. For this one, the waves needed to break somewhere right around in between this pier and this pier post. And then I would just kind of visually time how long it would take before the swirls would go away and how long I needed to keep it. So yeah, I did probably a 1 or 2 second exposure, and they weren't quite long enough. So I stopped at 4. I don't know that I did a whole lot more than that, because the problem with these kind of things is more than 4 or 5 seconds, you start to lose some of this fine texture and these sweepy lines in them. So, but yeah, when I'm shooting a coastal scene like this, I am going to work a variety of different exposures, usually somewhere between 1 and 4 seconds, depending on how fast that water's coming in, or how slow. This beach is particularly wide and flat, and so the waves are just kind of slow rollers. They don't move real fast. So timing it out is a little bit like that. So
I have a question too.
okay.
I had a question. Obviously at 4 seconds, I don't know how bright it was there, but you chance overexposing the image. So are you using the f-stop then to stop down in order to compensate for the long exposure?
No,
Or are
I'm
you using some kind of
filters.
neutral density filters?
Neutral density filters. And we're going to
Okay.
get into that here in just a minute. We're going to spend quite a bit of time on neutral density filters. Yes, I try not to crank my aperture down to really tiny pinhole apertures. I try to keep it in the sweet spot of the lenses that I'm using, and using filters to get where I need to for my different exposures. It's all about putting motion into that still image. Like I said, finding something that's static and not moving, and then putting the clouds. For me, clouds are the one thing I use a lot. How they pass across the sky over the long period of time. The image on the left is a dead cactus out in Joshua Tree, and I think that exposure took 5 or 6 minutes. So those slow moving clouds streaked across the sky, and that's the resulting image. And it just makes it more interesting, more dynamic, in otherwise just a plain old cloudy sky. And the same with this one here. It's just about making interesting patterns out of those clouds as they stretch themselves out.
So on question on these, you know, it mentions on the left 256 stacked images and 96 stacked on the right.
Mhm.
So my guess there is that you're actually taking like a fraction of a second shot for each of those and then stacking them. Is that a fair
Correct.
assumption?
Correct. In this particular one on the left, actually the camera, the Sony A7R II that I have, has an app that's built in that takes all of those images and stacks them into one raw file. And what it does is it creates a very clean, noiseless image, and it layers them almost like you would do it in Photoshop, but it does it for you and spits out a raw file that has great depth and great shadow recovery capability. And it, so it will do all of that on its own. And it's great for lenses like this Voigtlander that don't take filters. It's got a built-in metal hood, and it's a super wide angle 12 millimeter full frame lens. So filters would be vignetting on the sides really bad with that particular lens. So it does not accept filters. So I can't shoot long exposures with that any other way. And this one, on the other hand, I just did it because we were out in the middle of the desert and it was really hot, and I wanted to go sit under the trees and get a little shade. So put the camera out there and let it do its thing, and it does a really good job of it. So
Does it give you a preview as it's doing it, or are
No.
you doing this all when you get home, right?
It does not. Well, when it finishes doing the 256 exposures, where it just click, click, click at the duration, it shows you the image on the back of the camera, yes. And it puts out a JPEG and a RAW file. And it's probably it is probably the reason I haven't gotten rid of that camera yet, because they don't do that anymore with any of the newer Sony bodies. But that feature is so critical, because if these clouds started out back here. And so I kind of watched them until they got to this tree. I didn't want them to get really too far past this tree because I wanted this tree to stand out in this blue sky. So because I can stop it at any time and it builds on it and it's not going to be underexposed, I can let it run for however long I want to, or if it's in like a sunset condition, I can stop it if the sunset starts to get too dark, or in a sunrise where it starts to get too bright, I can stop it and it will build on what it's done, as opposed to a standard long exposure of 4 minutes. If you stop it at 2 minutes, it's going to be horribly underexposed. So that's the other reason that sometimes this app that's in the camera, I really like using it for the versatility and ability to stop and start whenever the light conditions are right.
Sure.
Are you going to talk about your post-processing and to stack 256 images, and are you using?
Does it? The camera does that.
Oh, okay, it's automatic.
It's automatic. It does it all in camera as it's taking the picture, and then it gives me a raw file that looks just like this one on the left. It does it all by itself, which cuts down on a lot of post-production time. And it's just smoother. It has an algorithm built in that tries to close the little bit of a gap that happens, particularly on really fast-moving clouds, from one exposure to the next. So
are you saying that there's no change in your exposure settings, or just different times, and that's how you get the blur?
on these particular images, yes. This is 256 images at the same ISO 50 f10, and it was probably, that's middle of the day, it probably 250th of a second.
Okay.
And then it just does 256 of them. And it takes a while. It's not linear where you can multiply 256 times the whatever shutter speed was and do the math to find it out. It actually takes longer. So it's an average and an algorithm. It's pretty neat software for $5. So neutral density filters, who's got some? Who has neutral density filters? How often do you use them? Much, a little bit, not at all?
What?
A lot.
I use them a lot. And when I first got started in photography, I used round filters that were screw-on filters. And for anyone that doesn't really know what neutral density filters are or how they work, the way I decided to present this was this white background is actually a large softbox that I put the filters on and took pictures of them from above so that you could see that the light is being cut out as it gets more stops added to the glass. So a 3-stop filter cuts out a certain amount of glass, and a 6-stop cuts out more, up until a 16-stop. A 10 and 16 on most days, you can't look through them and see anything. They are cutting out a lot of light, which just means that you have to make a really long exposure to get back to the properly exposed image. And when I started out, I was using round filters, but I didn't like the fact that, I needed to either have fumbly step-down rings or more of them. And so I changed to square filters because I still use graduated neutral density filters also. And so the square filters allowed me to change those easier, but also made it so that I buy one set of filters that can easily work with all of my different lenses. When I first started giving this presentation, people would always ask about a variable neutral density filter. And I hadn't had a whole lot of experience with them. I'd seen some bad effects of them. But on a workshop I did for long exposure a couple years ago, a couple of my participants were using variable neutral density filters. And these are the images that came out of their cameras with those filters. And they've allowed me to use them to present them here. To me, a variable neutral density filter is 2 circular polarizer filters basically working against each other, trying to cancel out the light. And for those that think that these might have been a really cheap one, no, this was a $150 filter. And this was the results it gave at the least effect and the most effect. And this one was another not cheap filter, and it has bright corners and dark corners. And so I just don't use neutral density filters that are variable. I understand that there are some out there that are really expensive, $300 something a piece. If anyone wants to buy me one and let me go try it, I'd be glad to. But I'm not really in the market to do that. I don't want to show up on a scene wherever I'm traveling to and find out that I'm going to get that kind of result from the filter. So
I'll save you the effort of doing the testing. I sold my Stingray and went to the squares.
yeah, I've used the Stingray once, and it's a pretty expensive filter, and I was not really impressed with it. It wasn't nearly as bad as this, but it was still there. It was still pretty obvious. And then I did my own testing on one that was supposed to be a really good filter that they told me was good and wouldn't have the banding effect, and it still did. At any aperture, it was at f8, at f2. So I just can't risk having this happen to my images. Like this, I traveled all the way to California, and I can't risk the loss of the image for that kind of effect. So I stick to the square filters that I don't have that problem with. One thing to consider when you're thinking about buying filters is that most neutral density filters have a little bit of a color cast. The top left image is the scene with no filter. And then the format high-tech Firecrest is what I use. You can see that it is now a long exposure, but it is almost the same color. The sunlight came out a little bit, but the color is still very neutral and it doesn't have a color cast. Whereas the Lee Big Stopper kind of tends to turn everything a little on the blue side. And then this older high-tech Pro version had a little bit of a green cast to it. When I first started, this color cast was pretty easy to recover and fix in post-production, but I decided I'd really rather not have to do that. So I switched over to one that's much more color neutral. And so color neutral is really important to me. It means less color shift and less potential for degraded image quality in post-production. These are some of the essential accessories. The square filters fit in this filter holder. I like this one because it's really light. It's not terribly expensive and it only has one moving part. When I'm out on the edge of a cliff shooting seascapes in the wind, I don't want a whole lot of screws and things that are moving parts. So this filter holder is durable. I've dropped it on the ground and it doesn't break, it doesn't scratch, it doesn't bend. And I have one of these aluminum filter rings for every lens diameter I have. And because they work on more than one lens at a time, they are easy to carry. I carry 3 or 4 of them on any given trip. And then they're easy to swap between lenses and move them back and forth.
Hey, Travis.
Yeah.
Reed would like to know what brand of filter holder is that?
I just saw that come up.
Okay.
This is the Lee Foundation holder, and it is the original version that they made for a lot of years. They have now released a newer version that's still pretty simple. The one nice thing about the newer version is that the little pin that you pull is a little bit bigger. It has a little more heft to it. This one can sometimes feel a little skinny, but it is super light, but it has served me well for about 8 years now. But that's the Lee filter holder. The one that Format High-Tech makes has a lot of fiddly bits and springs and parts and pieces, and I'm just going to lose all of those. I know I will. So I like to keep it simple. Did that answer your question?
He said thank you.
Okay. Another thing I always recommend is to use a remote control for taking long exposure photographs. I particularly like one that is wireless, that can be programmed, and then I can plug this piece into the camera and I can program my exposure on this piece, and I can activate the shutter with this piece and not touch the camera. If we're working with a 5,000th of a second exposure, a little bit of camera shake from pushing the button, probably not going to show up. But on a 1 or 2 or 3, 4 minute exposure, any little bit of motion in the camera can start to show up and create an image that isn't as sharp as you want. So I try to use a remote control that I can activate without touching the camera. that's programmable. I can tell it I need a 2-minute exposure and it will give me a 2-minute exposure, as opposed to hit the button and hope to remember that in 2 minutes I can push the button again to stop it. Because I've got ADD. When I'm out shooting with my friends, I might forget, and then I'll have a 12-minute exposure of nothing. So I just like to have one that is programmed. And I actually usually will program it to do the same 2-minute exposure 3 or 4 times. And that way it just shoots 3 or 4 of them. And I don't have to fiddle with it. I don't have to touch it. I don't have to mess with any of the settings. And I don't have to worry about messing something up or changing something that I don't want to have changed in my shot. I also keep little lens pens and filter cloths handy because we're not shooting at f1.4 or 2.8. We are going to be shooting at f9, f10, 11. So we want to make sure that the rear element of the filter is clean, the rear element of the lens, the front element, just keeping any little bit of dust and things off to reduce the amount of time you have to spend in post-production removing spots. I've got images that I spent a lot more time removing spots than I did even getting to the location because I wasn't paying attention to that. So I try to keep all of that clean and clean and tidy and keep it easy when I get back to the computer. Another thing that for a regular DSLR to think about is a term called light leak. And that is light getting in through the viewfinder or accessory ports or a lens mount and getting to the sensor. I don't know if anyone's ever experienced light leak on a long exposure image, but when the shutter and everything is up and the viewfinder is there, if the viewfinder is exposed to light, it can let light in and through the mirror body and down to the sensor and actually affect your image. This is an image from a friend of mine who was shooting out at Bodie Ghost Town, and he was shooting a long exposure, and when he saw it on the screen, he's like, what happened here? And all of those little particles are dust particles on the viewfinder. That the sun was coming in at just the right angle behind him. You can see that the sunlight is behind him here, and it was coming in at just the right angle that it was going through the viewfinder, and it made it look like this double exposure. The first time I ever had it, I was shooting in New York City, in New Jersey, looking at New York City, and I would start my exposure, and then I would come back to it, and it had this great big rosy bloom right in the middle of it. And I couldn't for the life of me figure out what it was. And after 2 or 3 tries, I stood behind the camera to figure out what it was, and it didn't do it. And so I turned around to realize the sun was setting directly behind me in New Jersey, right down the alley of 2 buildings. And so when I would step out of the way of the camera, it was blasting on the back of the camera. So I carry, it's just a little storm cover, kind of like you would use if you were shooting out in the rain. And I'll put that over the camera if I feel like there's going to be a potential for light leak coming in from the sides or the viewfinder on a DSLR. That way you just block all that light from getting into the camera.
Travis, Ken asked if that happens with mirrorless. Or
I do not have that problem with mirrorless through the viewfinder, no, because it's an electronic viewfinder. I have had that problem shooting with mirrorless with tilt shift lenses. That's why through the lens mount, when a tilt shift lens shifts all the way to one side or the other, it might actually have just enough of a gap that light can get through there over the course of your 3 or 4 minute exposure. I have experienced that with a mirrorless camera. I have not had a problem with it through an accessory port or through the viewfinder, obviously. So if I'm using a tilt shift lens and doing extended exposures, I still will cover the camera. But overall, the mirrorless cameras have not had that problem. So,
when would you use a tilt shift lens out in landscapes like this?
I've got several coming up later in the presentation. So yeah, I use a tilt shift a lot. I love tilt shift lenses. I love them for landscape photography. I could do an entire presentation on tilt shift lenses, but that's not what we're here for tonight. But they are very useful, and they have, if you understand the concept behind them, they're very useful for landscape photography. So, but I've got a couple in here. We'll show them in a minute. Obviously, if we're going to be shooting 2 or 3 minute exposures, we're going to need a really sturdy, stable tripod. I have gone through a fleet of tripods in the last several years and finally found some that are really nice and stable. What I'm showing here is that tripods with a center column, I try to avoid using those if I'm doing long exposures, because even as tight as I can get this collar to lock down, because this is extended, there's still a connection there that can cause vibration. So if the column on your tripod doesn't come out, I would always recommend to seat it down as far as it can go and get it as tight as you can. If you have one that can take the center column out, I recommend that. I will do that if I'm going to be doing long exposures. I'll put it back in if I'm doing architecture or video where I need to be able to have a little bit more fine control. But for doing landscape photography, I usually leave the center columns out. And I always try to get the legs spread out as wide as I can and as stable as I can. And sometimes I even have a tendency to, like in this picture, wedge one in between a rock, because any kind of vibration is just going to ruin the image. My tripods all look pretty beat up. They're never going to sell on the used market in like new condition. They've got the battle scars of having been all over the country and done lots of photography. So they're doing their job. They're getting the camera nice and stable and getting me a sharp image. So
I got a question.
okay.
Are there rules for when you use the pins or the rubber feet?
I typically do not use the spiked feet. When I'm shooting on the beach is the one time when I think that spiked feet can help, but I've seen that can still be affected by the sand settling under spiked feet. I mean, unless you're shooting with spiked feet that are, daggers that are 8 inches long,
yeah,
those little spiked feet really don't make that much of a difference. So when I'm shooting by the beach, what I try to do is get my camera out there and let it get hit by the waves a little bit and just gently kind of coax it down into the water a little more. And I'm usually only doing that for those 2 or 3 second exposures where I'm timing it to get the water coming at me. If I'm doing something at the beach that is a really long exposure, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, I will make sure I'm set back far enough that the water is not going to affect the tripod. Not to mention, those little spiked feet are miserable when you stab yourself in the leg with them on accident. I was on a workshop several years ago, and somebody had those and went to get up and kind of slipped, and the tripod stabbed them right in the side of their leg, and they ended up having to get stitches from it because it was that bad. So, and TSA probably doesn't like them very much. So I try to avoid using them, but. So we're kind of past the gear and the equipment. Now my typical workflow is a little different than if you're showing up to shoot pictures of still frames. Because there's usually a lot more planning involved, and with long exposures, sometimes you're only going to get 1 or 2 exposures at the peak time. Some sunsets or sunrises or whatever, or peak light, don't last very long. And if it's not going to last very long, you want to get there early and try to find your composition and get set up and get started and get ready well ahead of time. I never recommend trying to be rushed with long exposure photography. Anytime I've ever done that, I usually end up with really poor images, and I always kick myself for not getting there earlier. But I'll get to a location and I'll kind of scout it out and figure out what my composition is going to be, what's the story I'm telling, what's going to be the key light or moment of impact in the image. And I'll shoot a couple of images that don't have any filters on them, like this top one here, that are best just a baseline standard exposure where I try to get all of my settings dialed in just right. I'll manually focus and try to make sure that I've got the building being sharp like I want it to be, and just make sure I've got the highlights where I want them and the shadows where I want them, and make sure my exposure is good. And in this case, the exposure was f9, 1/20th of a second in ISO 50. And then I use this calculator on my phone that's an exposure calculator that I can dial in the number of filter stops that I want to add to it. Because in the exposure triangle, I only want to mess with one thing, and that's my shutter speed. I want to leave my aperture and my ISO alone if I can. So I've decided that I'm going to need about 11 stops of filter. So I'll stack my filters for the duration that I'm expecting, and I'll shoot an image or two as a test to see if my exposure is still good. I still have controlled my highlights. I've still controlled my shadows. The water texture looks good to me. And so now I feel like I've got my exposure where I want it. And now I'm going to wait until the light is just right to do my next exposure. And for this one, that was when the light sand dunes, that morning light was hitting the side of the lighthouse. And so my exposure was 2 minutes, and I really only got 2 shots at it because before too long, the light got too high, and then all the trees back here in the background got lit up and the light was gone. So it's just a matter of being ready and being there on time and ahead of time and ready to go and get everything set up and be ready to wait and then enjoy it. Because one of the things I like about long exposure is while that exposure is running, I can sit there and enjoy the sunrise instead of running around trying to shoot 18 different pictures of the same thing. I can just shoot that one and create one really strong image.
Travis, I have a question.
Okay.
When I try to get there and get set up and I get my exposure set, but then what happens is the intensity of the light is changing as it gets closer to the time.
That's
so
correct.
Are you anticipating the fact that the light is going to be getting stronger
Yes.
and brighter?
Yes.
And how do you do that in your calculator?
Well, in this one, it was telling me 11 stops gives me 1 minute and 42 seconds. So I put on 12 stops and that got me out to 2 minutes. And because it's not changing a whole lot from this, it's more just the light hitting the lighthouse. I didn't have to worry about that so much on this one, but on other cases, yes, you do have to kind of anticipate, am I gaining light or losing light? And if I'm gaining light in the morning and my key light point is going to be when it's brighter, I'll try to put on either another stop of filter or I'll just shorten my exposure to compensate. And the same in the evening. If I want to go longer, I'll just lengthen the exposure and compensate with filters or changing the exposure time. But yeah, you do kind of have to anticipate whether the light is going to be building or fading. I don't know about the rest of y'all, but when I first got started in long exposure, I had no idea what stops meant. Ludwig will probably tell you when he first met me, I didn't know a whole lot about what I was doing. And I didn't understand that a 10-stop filter was cutting out 10 stops of light. I knew it just made long exposures, but I didn't understand the math. For every stop, it doubles the exposure. And when I finally figured that out, I was like, wow, that means that's why this 70-second exposure was so dark, because I had 12 stops of filter on there and I was shooting and I was really only at, 6 stops of filter. So this is the same filter set up for 70 seconds and 150 seconds. And it was still horribly underexposed because it was the early morning light. The sun hadn't quite gotten up yet. And I just didn't understand what I was doing. And I was so frustrated. So I try to explain for those that don't understand that for every stop, you double your exposure. So it goes from 1 second to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16 to 32. And you can see that a stop from 32 seconds is really 64 seconds. And when I was in the field, I was adjusting the 70 seconds by 5 seconds at a time. And so I had 10 images in a row that looked exactly the same because 5 seconds to a 70-second image is such a fraction of a stop that it didn't really matter on the exposure and it didn't change it much. I finally ended up taking off the 6-stop filter and I had only 8 stops and I was at 60 seconds and I turned it into a black and white because this was the color cast that those round filters that I started out with, and I could not figure out how to get the color right. That water in this area was actually bright green. That coastal water was so bright and green that it just looked like muddy bayou water from Houston. And I was so frustrated that I just ended up going to a black and white image for it. I quickly sold those filters because I didn't like the way the images I was getting with them. And that's when I switched over to the squares that were more color neutral. When shooting long exposures, it's really important to keep the ISO as low as possible, because the higher ISO, the longer the exposure, the more sensor noise you get. This is, I don't know, does the little green and red spots show up for everybody in this one? Okay. That is all sensor noise. Those little green and blue, those aren't twinkly lights out in the ocean. It wasn't bioluminescence, it's sensor noise from a Canon full frame sensor that I would not have expected would have that kind of noise at ISO 200. But at a 4-minute exposure on a hot and humid night, the sensor got too hot and it generated too much noise. So I always try to keep my ISO around 50 or 100, whatever the lowest ISO your camera is capable of. Not the base ISO. Some, like I think Nikon, some of them, the base ISO is 200, and a lot of Canons it's 100. But I like to use the ISO 50 because it gives me a whole extra stop to work with on adjusting my exposure either up or down, depending on whether or not, like you're saying, Tracy, is the light building? So I can turn the ISO down to 50 instead of 100 and compensate that way and not have to change the number of filters I'm on. Or is the light gaining or getting darker, I'll change from ISO 50 to ISO 100 and give myself that one extra stop. And so I use ISO 150 depending on where my scene is and what my light is doing, but I try to stay at a lowest ISO possible because you can see that ISO 50 is much cleaner with less noise on the same duration exposure than ISO 200. And this wasn't, I mean, this was a fairly expensive Canon full frame camera that ISO 200 looks worse than, you know, ISO 6400 on my other cameras now. So.
And so were you using neutral density filters on these shots that are in this slide?
Yes. These all had probably 12 stops of neutral density filter.
Okay. Okay.
This is blue hour, really. The sun had already gone down, but I really liked that glow on right over here where the sun was setting and how it transitioned into the blue hour here. And I really liked how it smoothed out the water to almost like just completely flat. The water was breaking pretty hard at that shot. And so I really wanted to minimize it and really get rid of all that texture. So the 4 minutes is a good duration for doing that. So yeah, there's a lot of filter on there, and my original exposures were much too dark, and that's why I turned it up to ISO 200 and ended up having to, you know, kind of scrap the image because I should have just taken filtration off, but I didn't. Composition is something that gets talked about a lot in photography, but for long exposure, there's so many more things to think about with composition. And one of them is the movement of your subject through the frame. I like to call it scene depth or the depth of the scene. In this particular image, I have something that's right overhead, but then I have stuff that's moving off into the distance and way off into the background. This scene has a lot of depth to it. It's everything from up front to miles away. And those scenes tend to have really more dramatic skies to me. You get to see the quick motion of the clouds here, and they progress as they come through. The clouds sweep right through at you. I've been accused of faking this image more than any other image in my catalog. I'm never shy about doing Photoshop work, but I don't really fake things. I've actually had to send people a screenshot of the raw file showing this because these clouds are moving at roughly the same speed these are. But the distance they're covering in this is so many pixels compared to what's all the way back here. And people have said, well, those clouds back there aren't moving much, and these are. That you faked that. But it's just a matter of those clouds closer to you are moving and covering more pixels than the ones in the far distance. The direction of movement is really important. Much like the last one, when the clouds are moving perpendicular to the sensor or to the camera, they will show more motion and they will show more interest, particularly if they're fast moving like they were in this image. These clouds were moving really fast onshore one morning, and they were moving right at me. So they give you that great big dramatic streaky cloud look. The only time I've ever been to Yosemite, Mother Nature did not get my memo, where I was asking for nice big clouds moving fast across the sky right at me. These clouds hardly moved at all over 4 minutes, and they moved parallel to me. So you can see that they didn't show much movement. They just kind of stretch out and make little cotton balls. So it's really important to, if you're thinking about shooting long exposures, to get to your location and kind of study what's going on. What's going to be in motion? Is it going to be water? Is it going to be clouds? Or is it going to be both? And we'll talk about that here in a minute. But studying them and figuring out where they're moving helps you set up where you need to be to optimize the effect of a long exposure image. Cloud density is also really important. The image on the left is, again, at Yosemite, and the clouds were much thinner and moving in the right direction on that day. The one on the right, the clouds had varied densities. Some of the clouds were really thick and heavy, and other parts, like in here, were thinner and let more of the sunlight come through. That's one of the things I like about shooting long exposures, is I can work in conditions that most other people were packing it up and leaving. This was a cold and windy day on the California coast, and no one else was out shooting except for me and the friend I had drug along with me. And he was like, "Why are we out here? You're not going to get a good image." Well, he has this image hanging on his wall in his house now, because he was like, "Wow, you fooled me. I didn't think we would get a shot out of that." But playing with different cloud densities, you can really work in an overcast scene that may not be as traditionally photogenic. But with long exposure, you can really work the different textures and cloud densities and make it work to your advantage. Again, working with patterns in dark clouds and light clouds and how the light comes through them. And long exposures just soften that and stretch it out a little bit and just make it a little more interesting, whereas, you know, the regular shot of this was just kind of boring. This is one when I was talking about making sure your tripod doesn't get hit by the water. This was a 3-minute exposure that the very first one, I didn't quite set my tripod back far enough, and the incoming tide just barely got to the outside leg and made it shift about 1 inch. And that made a duplicate image of the tree and everything in the image. So I had to redo it and do it again. But long exposures in cloudy conditions can create really dramatic minimalist images. They can just soften out all the edges of the clouds and all the edges of the water and make, for me, really interesting images. And here's one with a tilt shift lens. This is 3 different images shot with a tilt shift and neutral density filters and long exposure and stitched together. For me, when I was there, the waves crashing on the little shore here were just a little too obnoxious, and I didn't like the look of them. So a nice 2-minute exposure smoothed all of that out and let the brightness of the tufa out in Mono Lake stand out and be a kind of a nice subject. The water now mimicked the cloudless sky that we had. So this is the opportunity to use a tilt shift to shoot a much wider scene without any parallax or stitching errors.
So you were shifting then, you were shifting from
Yes.
left to right.
Shifting left to right for this. Mm-hmm. Again, minimalism, using the long exposure to smooth the water texture out just enough that the texture of the water doesn't become a distraction in an image. This one was only 20 seconds. The water was fairly calm. And speaking of fairly calm to not calm water, this slide kind of represents the effects of a 3-stop filter at 1/10 of a second, 1.5 seconds, 15 seconds, and 120. And the differences on what happens to moving water. This was out at Lake Lanier several years ago. And you can see that at 1/10 of a second, you still see the ripples of the waves. You see all the texture. At 1.5, the ripples are gone, but the texture is still there. At 15, we're starting to get rid of both. And at 2 minutes, we've gotten rid of all of it, and we've got that nice glassy, smooth water. So it's all a matter of figuring out what you want your final look to be. Do you really want that glassy smooth, or do you just want to get rid of some of the ripples? It's all a matter of personal preference. For me, when I'm shooting around water, it's usually going for this look here. I just like that real surrealistic look that it has. But it depends on if the water is crashing harder or softer. You know, in the last slide, the water was fairly calm, so 20 seconds got rid of all the texture. If you're shooting down at the ocean, sometimes 2, 3, 4 minutes is going to be necessary to get rid of all the texture. Because for me, sometimes the texture is very distracting. In this image on the left, the texture of the water has all the different facets that reflect all of the different little pieces of everything above the water. And so it gets very busy, and it's much harder to kind of see what's going on and see between all of these pilings. This is the exact same camera position at 4 minutes as opposed to a quarter of a second. And it just cleans all that up. And to me, it makes a much more interesting and surrealistic image. And when I talked earlier about waiting, I kind of got all these test shots done for this one, determined that 240 was probably a little too long, but I got ready and got set up and got ready for this one. And I was all ready to go. And when the sun got down low enough, the sky just lit up on fire. And I knew that a 30 to 40 second exposure would get rid of all the texture in the water, but still be short enough that I wouldn't miss the peak color in the sky, because the color in the sky lasted for maybe 3 minutes. So if I was trying to do a 4 minute exposure, I wasn't going to catch it. The color was fading really fast as as it went down. It built really fast. I mean, it was not so bright, and it was really bright, and then it was gone. So shooting a 30 or 40 second exposure allowed me to get like 3 frames to pick from. So
You're using a 17 to 40 zoom lens. Are you all the way out at 17 or?
yes, ma'am, all the way out at 17 for this one. This kind of explains the effect that the different durations have on flowing water, like waterfalls. The longer exposure, you can't see much of a difference between in this area on all 3 of them. The biggest difference is the little swirly here and the smoothness of the water here. The problem with shooting a scene like this and a 30-second exposure is getting a lot of movement in the trees in the background. You start getting into blending shorter exposures in to do that. But 10 seconds is usually more than enough to smooth all that texture out on a waterfall. And this was the final resulting image at 10 seconds. Another again with the tilt shift. You can see in this basic frame, this was the center frame with no shift on either side. That's all I could get at 24 millimeters. But because I was using a tilt shift lens, all of a sudden I could incorporate all of this side and all of this side, and just it allowed me to get a little bit closer and make all of the elements a little bit bigger, but still get the outsides and not worry about getting too much of the sky or too much of the ugly foreground in front of me. And that's one of the reasons I really like using a tilt shift lens for a scene like that. I could have backed up or shot with an 18 millimeter, but that would make all of the elements that much smaller in the frame.
I'm curious about your choice of f-stop here, 3.5.
That's just the maximum aperture of that lens. I'm at actually f16 for this image.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah,
That's
I'm sorry.
okay. And the tilt shift lenses are the only ones that I'll ever really shoot f16 or f22 because of the way they use the image circle. They're not subject to diffraction in a way that a standard lens would be. So that's the other advantage of them. You can shoot really small apertures and get really sharp images, depth of field front to back. And sometimes I like to go crazy and get 300 seconds on a frame. And I did that on this one because everything I did up to 1 or 2 minutes, the splash pool here in the foreground had too much texture in it, and I couldn't see the rocks underneath because that waterfall was running really hard that day. And so the only thing I could figure out was to put a bunch of filters on and go really long. And that was the way I got rid of all of the texture in the foreground. It was at ISO 400. It wasn't quite as hot that day, but all the rock kind of hides some of the noise in this particular image. But every now and then I'll go a little crazy and shoot really long with water. Not very often.
When you're shooting, you've got a black and white image here. I'm assuming you shot it in color because you were in RAW. Did you know ahead of time you were going to make it a black and white, or did you decide after you saw the processed image that you wanted to convert it to black and white?
No, for this one, I knew I was going black and white. A lot of times when I'm out in the field, I see it that way. I got my start in film photography in college, shooting black and white film. And so Ludwig will tell you that shooting black and white is totally different. You have to really consciously make decisions about tone and, tone juxtaposition that, to me, you have to think about that so much in the field to get a successful black and white image. Very rarely do I have an image that's converted to black and white that wasn't envisioned that way. I usually see them that way. And a lot of times I'll actually shoot with my camera set in the monochrome mode just to help facilitate seeing those tonal changes and the variations. Because I mean, these rocks, this bright section of rock contrasts this dark section of rock nicely, that, just because of the colors and understanding how the colors are going to look when they turn into monochrome. So did that answer your question?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
Thanks.
So we went over the different shutter speeds and how they affect the water. Now on clouds, 2-second exposures on the same scene, the 2 seconds, the clouds not moving much. They still have all of their little pillowy textures. At 20 seconds, they're starting to look like we've pulled them out and stretched them a little bit. And then at 160 seconds, that's definitely stretched them way out. So, and we've also blended in the water effect here. We've got ridges and waves and things that are still visible. And by the time we get down here, all that texture is really gone. And so it's really starting to get into that kind of dramatic, surrealist, long exposure image. And this was the final image at 160 seconds. And just like the last one, combining the effects, this was in Chicago. I really liked this kind of bat wing shaped cloud here. And the wind was moving in kind of this direction. So this cloud was moving out toward the lake as the sun was setting. And so I just kind of waited for it to get out here just a little bit more, and then started my stacking of the 256 images to really stretch that one out and create a neat shape in the clouds. But the thing that happens with water, like I talked about earlier, when the water has all the different facets and ridges, you lose some of the reflections of the buildings. And here, all of that, the building light is all now reflected down into the water. And to me, just is a little more interesting. And it just creates a different dynamic in the image that I particularly like. And I also use long exposures to turn really distracting elements into primary elements that make the scene work. We all know this spot. Who hasn't shot there? But turning all of those cars into the moving elements, it creates a motion in and out of the frame. Those lines draw your eye up from the bottom of the frame into the skyline, and just create a more interesting image for me. Again, just using the streaking light of the cars to create leading lines and to get rid of all the visual distraction on the highway. Who hasn't had people get in their way on their pictures, right? I mean, everybody's had that happen at least once or twice. When we were in Chicago, for some reason, I thought I might at one point have the bean all to myself. Little did I know that never happens unless you're going to be there at 3 in the morning. And even then, you might still share it. So rather than worry about all the people moving around, I created 3 30-second exposures and stacked them all together in Photoshop. This was actually done before I had the Sony that did it in camera. So now the people become part of the image. They become elements in the frame and part of the experience of the image, and the ghostly figures as they move around become subjects and interesting elements in the frame rather than distractions. I just wish that this little group of people had moved a little more over the minute and a half, but they didn't. So I had to deal with them just hanging out there. And that is the end of the presentation. If anyone has any questions, I'd be glad to answer them.
Boy, Travis, that is some spectacular shots.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I've got hard drives full of long exposures. I really like them. I love the look of them. And I mean,
Travis, what are you using for a hiking tripod these days? I've got a really right stuff tripod that's just getting too heavy to carry.
I have a really right stuff TVC 33 and a Gitzo Systematic 2. So I hike with too much equipment. My backpack is probably too heavy when I'm out hiking, unfortunately, but now that I'm doing more time lapse and motion control and stuff, I end up carrying a lot of equipment. So
yeah, I just getting into retirement, and that's just I can't do it anymore.
yeah, my problem with hiking tripods or really lightweight tripods for long exposures, they're just not sturdy enough. They're not stable enough. I really like them to be nice and stable and steady, and that really right stuff. I mean, my friends make fun of me with my little bitty Sony camera sitting on top of it because it looks like it could hold a TV camera. But you know, it doesn't move, it doesn't vibrate, it doesn't shake. So I still get really nice sharp images out of it. So
that tripod and ball head weighs more than all the rest of my stuff combined.
yeah, I think the tripod weighs as much as my whole backpack, but it does a good job. So
Do you have any projects on your to-do list, things that you want to do differently or learn? Or
I actually, right now, I am learning time lapse and motion control, because it's another way to take long exposure and turn it into more of a video. Ludwig's been nice enough to let me share some of my YouTube stuff over on your Facebook page. And I'm learning more about time lapse and that kind of thing because I'm just always trying to learn something new and kind of progress and trying to push my boundaries a little bit. So the time lapse thing is something I'm really getting into, but it is a whole different world of, you know, how to shoot it in the field, how to edit it, how to put it all together, and how to tell a story that way. So that's my current project.
do you have any wish list on your gear list?
I've spent the last 10 years kind of acquiring things a little bit at a time. And, you know, I take the money I make at photography and put it back into gear. And then whenever I feel like the gear is limiting me and not letting me create the images I want, that's when I start thinking about changing it out. But right now I've pretty much got my kit pretty set where I like it, that I can go to the racetrack and shoot pictures of the race cars. I can go do waterfalls. I can go do time-lapse stuff now. I don't really have a whole lot of gear lust right now. I've kind of gotten to the point now where I'm more focused on working on me and the craft of it than the equipment. So not really, no. I'm kind of where I'm at, want to be right now.
Has the pandemic changed anything about your workload or work style?
Yes. On an average year, I've probably got 15 to 20 photography assignments that are paid work. And I would normally go on, I mean, my wife will tell you too many trips. But I have only been on 2 dedicated photography trips this year. Death Valley in March or February, right before the pandemic started. And then I took a solo trip to Roan Mountain in June. Normally I'm gone doing something at least once a month. I mean, last year I went to the Smokies 6 times just to the Smokies. And I haven't been once this year. So I'm going in a couple of weeks. I've got some friends that I'm going to go with, but it has really affected. I mean, I've only done 2 paid work gigs this year, as opposed to I should normally have 12 or 13 in the bag already.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it has affected me quite a bit. I saw someone posting a question up there.
Oh, you're just getting a bunch of accolades. You should read them.
Do you use polarizer filters?
Yes. I use a polarizer on anytime I'm around water, particularly in streams and creeks and things like that, because a polarizer gives me about 1.5 stops of light neutral density cut, but it also cuts out glare and makes the foliage on leaves look better. I use a circular polarizer a lot out in nature, but shooting my main like wide angle landscapes, no, but I use them on architectural images a lot for interior work to control glare and highlights. Yeah. A good circular polarizer is something that I think should always be in somebody's bag. I've dropped more than my fair share of them. I was just joking with a friend last night that one of them is sitting at the bottom of Triple Falls up in Waterfall County. I was trying to put it on and it slipped and it landed on the rocks and just rolled end over end, just like a wheel, all the way down into the waterfall. So,
Yikes.
yeah, I think I've gone through 5 round polarizers. So now I've got the square ones that if I drop it, it just breaks. So,
how do you approach the idea of using the neutral density filters and the long exposure versus using the multiple stacked images of much shorter durations? Like when you're setting up the shot, like what's going to make you decide which approach you use?
Well, that's a great question. A lot of the time it depends on if the light is fading really, really fast or changing really fast, I'll use the stacked method just because I can stop and start the image quickly. But there are scenes that don't work with that. The stacked images don't work as well if you're at the ocean or something because it's averaging out the different exposures. So a 2/50th of a second exposure in water looks really bad when you start stacking them. So I'll use the stacked method more like if I'm out in the desert where I have a stationary object as my foreground and I'm only focusing on the clouds moving. Unless I can, and sometimes I'll stack, I'll put a neutral density filter on and do the stacked. Like the one I had of the sailboat, that was a stacked image of 30-second exposures because I wanted to make sure I could time it just right with the clouds. But because I had the water in there, I wanted to be able to make sure that the 30-second exposure would kill all the texture in the water, but then I could stop and start it for the clouds whenever I wanted to. So I will use them in conjunction a lot. I'll use both methods at the same time to create a really different image. Reed asked, where is Triple Falls? That's up in Transylvania County up in North Carolina, I think. DuPont State Forest is where Triple Falls is.
Travis, that looks like maybe Hyatt Lane or Sparks Lane there, that second one from the left on top.
This one here?
Yeah.
Yes, that is that's Sparks Lane out in Smoky Mountains. That's right at sunrise. The only way to do that is to walk. You have to hike in to get there. But that's the best sunrise I've ever had at Sparks Lane. That was a couple years ago before the tree got hit by lightning. I was leading the North Georgia group in there for a field trip. So we all hiked in and we were treated to a really nice sunrise that morning.
Fantastic. Well, you should read all of the accolades. It was such an interesting presentation and just so beautiful. Building off of your presentation, the theme for the monthly submissions next time will be long exposure photography. So you're going to get a chance to practice some of what Travis was talking about here. And those photos will be due by Saturday, October the 3rd. And if you haven't uploaded a photo for the critique before, just go to our website at pcphotoclub.org and you'll see a link where you can upload your photo in the channel called Monthly Theme. There'll be a video recording of tonight's meeting available up on our YouTube channel in a few days, and we'll send that out in the club news. So if you want to review any of this again as you get out and start doing it yourself, or if you want to share the presentation with your friends, you're welcome to do that as well.
Also, if anyone has any questions, post them on your Facebook page there. I'd be glad to answer any questions. You know, if you go out and try to shoot some long exposures and run into some trouble, or have a question about, you know, what didn't work or why did something happen, post it up there. I'm on that group and be glad to answer any questions you have.
Oh, that's very generous. I really appreciate that. Because, you know, it's one thing to see it and you can understand how it works. But then when you get out there and you're trying to do 256 images and then you go, okay, now what?
Well, you know, long exposure is one of those things that it really needs a lot of practice. Particularly like if you're thinking about going on a trip down somewhere that if you're thinking about going on vacation to the beach and you want to practice them, go up to Lake Lanier, because you have the same elements. You have water, you have clouds, and you can practice it in a location that if you screw it up, who cares? It's not your main shot that you're going for. You know, you didn't travel there and you have one night to shoot a sunrise or sunset and you botch it because you can't remember how to do things. Go practice it. I had to practice it a lot. So part of this presentation was all those things that I practiced and learned the hard way by screwing it up 10 times is what I try to kind of convey a little bit of the thought process on how to make it a little easier in the future. Because I didn't have anyone teach me this. I did it all by trial and too many errors. So
Words of wisdom, don't wait. If this is your first time trying something like this, don't wait till October 1st to start.
Yeah.
Let's see, what else I want to say. So our next meeting will be on Thursday, October the 8th. And David Dunnigan has lined up another great speaker for us. His name is Steve Ziegler, Z-I-G-L-E-R. You can look up his website, steveziegler.com. And again, some beautiful landscape work, quite different from Travis's, but also quite beautiful. Steve is a very interesting person. He has a PhD in chemistry, and that has been his day job, and working on PET scanning equipment. And we thought that with October coming up, some of us might like to get some inspiration for taking photos of the colorful leaves, taking a trip up in late October to take some landscape photos. So we thought that would be a nice topic for October. So we'll see you then, October the 8th. And in the meantime, start sending us your photos for our gallery. And I will officially adjourn the meeting now, but Travis, if you're willing to stay on the line a few minutes, if anybody wants to hang back and ask more questions or talk with you a few more minutes, then we'll have a chance to do that.
be glad to.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Thank you
Travis.
very much, Travis. Very beautiful. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much.